"You fool," said Jesus, "this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." The ushers will now receive the offering. No, not really. I was joking. But here's a serious question. Why did Jesus even need to tell this parable? He gives the punchline before the story. Here's what he says: "Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he goes on to tell a parable. We expect to hear a story that will prove his point, a story about someone who's very greedy. But the way Jesus tells the story, the man is not a bad man. There's no hint that he acquired his land illegally or that he exploited his hired hands. Jesus says nothing about the man usurping the lands of the poor in order to raise coffee or cotton for export. Just this one straightforward sentence: the land of the rich man produced abundantly. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. It's a wonderful thing when the land produces abundantly, when there's enough rain to grow the crops knee-high by the 4th of July, but not too much rain so the plants are drowned out, and hopefully no snow before harvest. The rich man's land produced abundantly. Now, some in the crowd might have been saying to themselves, "He must be a very devout man," because at least some of them knew their Bibles. Hear Deuteronomy 30. "You shall again obey the Lord, observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today. And the Lord your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all your undertakings, in the fruit of your body, in the fruit of your livestock, and in the fruit of your soil." The people who heard Jesus' parable might have been thinking to themselves, "God has surely blessed this man." Jesus doesn't point out sinful behavior when he said the man's land produced abundantly. But that wasn't all there was to the parable. Jesus lets the landowner speak for himself. "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods." What should I do? I will do this. I will pull down. I will build. I will store. I. This man's world is so small that he talks only to himself. "What should I do?" he asks. But he isn't asking anybody else. He answers his own question. These are my crops, my barns, my grain, my goods. He has no connections beyond himself. He has no memory of God, who commanded the people of Israel to leave grain at the edges of the field for sojourners and widows. He can't see beyond the edges of his own fields, nor does he wonder if there are some people who have no grain at all. This man is isolated in a world he has created for himself. The land is his, the barns are his, the grain is his, and the goods are his. He has no neighbor. He has no need of God. The only words that sound a little like a prayer are the words of one man talking to himself. "And I said to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But there would not be many years. There wouldn't be even one more morning. "You fool," said God, "this very night your life is being demanded of you." God didn't call the man a fool because he was productive, but because the man was lost inside his own distorted definitions of the world. My barns and crops, my grain and goods. How foolish that will sound by morning. It would sound foolish even if this man lives another 50 years. Talking to yourself is not enough. Following Jesus calls us beyond ourselves, and Jesus' call usually has economic implications. This whole section of Luke is about the odd economy of God. Jesus summarizes this section by saying, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." You can't read very far in the Bible without bumping into God's odd economics. Wherever he went, Jesus called people beyond the M word. My crops, my grain, my barns, my stock options, my 401k, my possessions. Jesus knew this would be so difficult for people. Seeing beyond our own interests has become even more difficult in our time of history. I and my are more popular pronouns than we and ours. Consider the debates in Congress about the Farm Bill and food stamps. Some members of Congress want stricter work requirements for people who receive SNAP payments, commonly known as food stamps. Now, 91% of people in Congress are Christians, so it's not unusual to hear someone quote scripture. One favorite text comes from 2 Thessalonians. Not long ago, a representative from Texas cited Paul's letter in the debates. Here's what he said. But you know, in 2 Corinthians 3:10, Paul says, when we were with you, we gave you this rule. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. So, the representative said, I think it's a reasonable expectation that we have work requirements. Really? Almost 45% of those who receive food stamps are children. They shouldn't be working. Another 30% are elderly or people with disabilities. They may not be able to work. Well, what about the rest? Many are working, in fact, most of them, but they don't make enough to feed themselves or their families. Jesus must wonder why people like that one rather obscure verse so much, while they neglect most of the Bible. I've never heard anyone in Congress quote Jesus' parable about the man who built bigger barns. My crops, my cotton, my hard work, my money, my subsidies, my. Somebody suggested that food stamp recipients should somehow make their way onto the floor of the House. We shouldn't permit our legislatures to continue making these decisions in a vacuum, isolated from the very people whose lives they are toying with. That is, our legislators shouldn't keep talking only to themselves. It's not enough to talk about my crops and my grain and my barns and my happy life. Jesus is calling us to see beyond the borders of our fields or bank accounts or investments. Jesus isn't trying to scare the hell out of us. He's trying to give us a vision of a truly abundant life.